Hey all, welcome to the second episode of Conversations. If you haven't listened to the first one yet, Conversations is a unique podcast where I talk to some of my favorite people about deep topics that I'm personally really interested in. We don't spend time on background and context. You can find all that elsewhere, and that just lets us get to the really interesting stuff immediately. For this episode, we have Avichal Garg, co-founder of Electric Capital. Avichal is truly one of my most favorite people, and I feel like I always come out of talking to him with some super unique insights. Before Electric, Avichal has founded startups, he's worked as an exec at Facebook, and has been a prolific angel investor as well. I met Avichal when he angel invested in DYDX 5 years ago, and we've been good friends ever since. So many things about this conversation were really meaningful and insightful to me, so I'm hopeful they will be for you as well. So without further ado, let's jump in. Avichal, hey man, how's it going? It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
So I heard you had to reschedule this podcast recording because you just recently had a baby.
Yeah, that's right.
I was messaging you about it and you were like, hey, I feel like I would love to do it. So happy to, but I'm having a baby. So can we reschedule? And I was like, okay, sure. That's like the most legit excuse you could possibly have for,
that's right.
for rescheduling. But how's that been? How's life been since then?
Babies are great. Babies are like a booster pack on life. They just make life so much better. So
babies that was super interesting when you were saying that to me. Like one of the things you said to me in the last time we talked, which I thought was super interesting and I never really heard anybody say before, was you were kind of wishing that you had kids sooner, or at least kind of advising like others to consider doing that. I felt like that was a really interesting viewpoint because that is so different, I feel, to how the successful person or whatever thinks about it. I feel like most people like super highly value like finding the right person, like spending a lot of time on their career. So like, how do you think about the life decision of when to have kids, or like, how did you think about it for yourself? And like, what would you have done differently in retrospect?
Dang, dude, you're going for the heavy.
Going hard right off the bat. Yeah, it'll get easier over time to set the tone.
All right. So okay, a lot to unpack there. So at least for me, and I think it's a very personal decision. So first and foremost, like people should have kids if they want to. It's like personal decision. There's a lot rolled in there.
Yeah,
I was very fortunate to have like a good upbringing and good relationship with my parents and my wife and our in-laws. And so there's like a lot we have going for us. We're very fortunate to have resources so we can like, order food in if we feel like it. There's like luxuries that we get that make our lives a little bit easier too. But like kind of the thought sort of came from the realization that had I had kids earlier, like when I was 25 or 26 or something, and I would have been sort of grossly unprepared for it emotionally. And today I'm like prepared for it. So and that's like a spectrum. That's an evolution that's happened over the last 10 years. And I'm more financially prepared now as well. But the reality is you start running the numbers and you're like, man, like, will I get to see my grandkids? Like if I'm 80 and my kids are like in their 30s, like, or actually 40s, that may not be enough, like if like everybody kind of has kids, like if you just sort of round the numbers, you're like, okay, if you have kids, you start having kids when you're 40, which is not atypical on the coast. And then your kids have kids when they're in their 40s, like you just may be too old to enjoy your grandkids, and be around and help them through that. And so it's sort of like your mortality hits in a different way. And you're like, man, what would I give to have like an extra 5 years with my kids or my grandkids, 30 years from now. And in the grand scheme of things, like what would have changed if I had kids 10 years earlier, like in my mid 20s,
right?
Probably not that much in the grand scheme of things. Like if I just had them in my late 20s.
I mean, do you think you would have been able to be as successful and kind of focused on your career and stuff?
It's a good question. Probably not. But it's sort of all relative, it's sort of like, it's a little bit of a luxury too. It's sort of like, I've been fortunate enough to be really successful. And so it's sort of like, does it like the extra little bit of money relative to what I have, or, the extra, like how would my life actually change if I were like 50% less successful or something? Like actually turns out not that much, but it's like a personal thing because it's sort of a side effect of having had the good fortune to be really, really successful. Or, the other way to think about it is maybe it just sort of it's sort of a throughput thing. It's like I would have been just as successful, but 5 years later. And in the grand scheme of things, does that really matter? You're just sort of like time shifting the days and hours that you spend with your kids.
Yeah.
And like, if you did it when you're 28 instead of 35, like, does it really matter that much?
Yeah. So I think it's worth considering. I haven't really decided if I
Yeah.
totally believe you or not yet.
Yeah.
I guess just
Yeah.
kind of pushing you on it a little bit because
Yeah.
I'm interested. Like, I
Yeah.
agree with
Well,
you, but
that.
I feel, I think
Sorry.
the thing I was going to say is that it's career success. I mean, life in general is exponential, right? So I feel
Yeah.
like, especially focus is not like a linear thing, I feel
Yeah.
like. So it's like the more you probably focus on your career earlier on, like the higher your exponent is, right? And then like that can just make it go way faster. That's kind of the mental model I've always used, right?
Yeah.
Because I probably atypically kind of came into my career like hoping I was retired by the time I was like 35,
Yeah.
just as a new software engineer. But
Yeah.
now I'm 30, and that doesn't seem like so long from now.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to be a little bit later than that. But
Yeah.
that was kind of my mental model, is like, oh, I'll just focus on this, hopefully have like, or at least possibly have like some exponential amount of success. But I feel like it is relatively important to focus given that.
Yeah. The other thing is like, even if there's a little bit of a trade-off with career, there's also the thing that, if you look at most people, and there's a little bit of a, if you're truly an outlier in terms of success, it certainly could work differently. But for most people at the end of their life, they're like, what really mattered? And ultimately what mattered was like, did you do good work? Did you do things that were like high integrity that you can be proud of? And did you spend time with your family and your close friends?
Right.
And so like the thing is like those like those extra, let's say if you just have kids 5 years earlier, that extra 5 years that you get with your kids might actually be like,
right. It might
that
just
also
be worth
like,
more than that.
yeah, exactly. It's like that also exponentially compounds, right? And so it's like, okay, well, you've like exponentially compounded a thing for an extra 5 years. That if you look at how most humans are, that is actually the thing that they're proud of at the end of their life, and that was the most meaningful for them. And so you actually compound that for an extra 5 years. So that's the other side of it. But it's harder to quantify, right? Because there isn't like a number that you can put against that, or there isn't like,
I definitely agree with that too. Like probably most people, if they're towards the end of their life and they're reflecting, they come away with the desire to have spent more time with their family, or prioritize that more relative to career. Not everybody, but probably most people.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's just kind of like a perspective thing, right? Because it's like hard to understand what having kids is going to be like until you do it, right? And you can listen to people that have kids, but it's not exactly the same thing.
Yeah. It's, the closest analogy I have for people is it's like doing a startup, which is like, there's the idea of doing a startup, and even like being employee one at a startup is not the same thing as being the founder. Like there's this sort of like thing which people talk about, and they say something to the effect of like, oh, founders get so much equity relative to employee one, but employee one takes just as much risk. And I think that's actually kind of BS. Like usually the people who say that 98% of the time are people who are not founders, because founders understand that like, it's psychologically very, very, very different to have started the thing. And to me, the closest analogy is it's the difference between being a parent and being an uncle, which is like, you still love the thing if you're employee one and you were there from like day zero. But it's like genetically not yours exactly. And like at the end of the day, there isn't this like 10% background process running in your brain 24/7 that's thinking about that thing. And if you leave, like, if you're just like not in the kid's life as the uncle, like it's okay if the parents are good. But like if you leave as a parent, that's like devastating to a child, right? Biologically, chemically, like everything. And that's the same thing as a startup. Like if the founder leaves, that means something very different than employee one leaving. So that's like the closest proxy. And to your point, like it's kind of like trying to talk to people about what it feels like to do a startup if they've never done a startup. It's just like just lived experience. You're like, you just have to go do it. And if you go do the startup, you're like, you understand what it feels like. And you're like, oh, now I have empathy for what it means to be a founder. This is why we hire so many former, like almost half the electric team is former founders. And I think it's like a really important cultural thing, because I think I have a personal bias, obviously, because I've been a founder, but I think it's hard to be a good early stage investor if you don't have that empathy for founders. Like if you've never actually done it, I think you're just not going to be as good.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I mean, there certainly is this kinship among those who have been founders, and especially like those who have been founders of something that they've tried really hard on or had like some reasonable amount of success. I mean, it's hard even if you fail in the early days, but it's almost like harder if you have some amount of success where you like now really built something that's valuable, and like all these people joined you and all these people invested in you, and
Yeah.
like this product that users actually use, and it's like, holy
Yeah.
shit, I have to deal with the
All of it. Yeah.
expectations of running this.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with you. I mean, I super highly value investors, like from my perspective, that have had founder experience, and I think there's just something different there. I mean, I think you can kind of talk about
Kinship, I
it,
think, is the
but
right word.
kinship is right, yeah. But it's just like a life thing in general, right? Like you can hear something intellectually, but that's different than feeling and like living it.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
It's, yeah, it really changes. It just resets so many things if you've lived that. I don't know if you heard that. There's that Elon quote he said at some point, and something like, being a founder is like chewing glass and staring off into the abyss, right? And that's like what it feels like sometimes. And it's like a very lonely experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a real. It's why so many founders hang out with other founders. That's why like so many founders friends. Like if you ever go to a founder's wedding and then you look around, it's a bunch of other founders.
Yeah.
It's like it's definitely the people at their company, but it's also a bunch of other founders and former founders. And I don't think that's an accident.
Yeah. You also said something else interesting, and I'll kind of tie it back to an experience I've had in the past year. I kind of had this existential crisis sort of a year ago where like DYDX was doing reasonably well. Like it was worth a decent amount of money. We had awesome employees. I felt like enough success to like satisfy my ambition basically. I was working with a lot of my friends. I was moving to New York. I was living around all my friends. And I kind of took a look at my life and I was like, all these external things like money, success, friendships, like being around people that I loved and cared about, I was like 10 out of 10 on. I like couldn't imagine a better world for myself, which I realize is a very privileged position to be in. And I'm happy to have had that experience. But I kind of had this experience where I was like, what the hell am I supposed to do now? Because I'm still like 7 out of 10 happy on average. And I was like, why? I'm not depressed or anything, but like, what am I supposed to do now? Like, I don't know where to go from here. Like, I'm curious if you've ever had some experience like that, or have had, talk to people that have had similar
1000%.
things.
Yeah. 1000%. I think, I mean, that's, at least for me, that was a really big unlock and realization, because that is the moment where I went from, it's almost like a Buddhist thing. You just realize like none of this stuff matters. You're just like, oh, that's not actually what's going to make me happy. And you're like, it's not the success. It's not the money. It's not like, none of that external stuff matters. And then it forces, and it's another one of these things that I think is just like lived experience. Like to me, it had to have been like, the history of the guy that they call Buddha now, right? Siddhartha Gautama. He had to have been a prince, right? Because he had to have all the material desires met, and then all of a sudden wake up and be like, why am I still not happy? Like I have everything that people say I should have to be happy, and I'm not. And then that's where I think you have to kind of go inward. And that's where people tend to do a couple of things. They tend to say, oh, like the thing I actually care about is my family. So I'm out. I'm just going to go sit on a beach. And I remember when I was much younger, when I was like in college, I'd be like, why would you ever do that? Like I didn't understand it, but now I kind of get it, because like I've gotten all those things and I'm like, okay, I'm still not happy, but like hanging out with my kids makes me happy, or hanging out with my parents, makes me happy in a way they just didn't when I was a teenager, or my cousins or whatever. People just turn into like work or craft. So there's sort of a like, I just want to do the thing and be really good at the thing. There's like self-satisfaction and just like being the best at a thing. And that's a very common end state. And the other is sort of committing yourself to something that's like beyond yourself, is sort of like a mission or a purpose. And that is like an organizing principle. Those are the three that I've seen. And it is a privilege to be able to sort of think that way. Most people don't get to have the luxury to be there, but yeah, it's a very common thing, especially. I think this is another reason why founders and successful founders end up hanging out, because everybody sort of goes through that journey. And then you sort of have enough success that you sort of like check all those boxes, and you're like, but I'm still not happy. Like, why am I not happy? And you kind of have to then go on this like it's like a second quest you have to do. The first quest was like trying to be successful and build the thing and like not die as a company, and then build your team and all that stuff. And then you're like, wait, I kind of achieved that quest. It turns out there's a whole different quest that I'm supposed to be on now.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you said something interesting in our fireside chat. We kind of talked about the same thing, but you were like, most people do get to this point in their life, but usually it's like when you're much older later. And you're like, oh shit, I'm about to die. Like what do I actually care about if I have
Yeah.
10, 20, whatever years left to live? And
Yeah.
then most people sort of have some sort of similar experience to what you're saying. And a lot of people, especially later in life, will turn to their family and they'll turn
Yeah.
to like, oh, I want to export my values onto people. I want to
Yeah.
focus on the people that I care about. So I thought that was super interesting too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, like a lot of cultures and religions have kind of baked this in. So like
Mm,
Hinduism has this notion of like thirds of your life that you're supposed to do. And so like the first, third is sort of like you're focused on yourself and getting yourself off the ground and where you need to be. And then the next third, you're sort of like focused on your family. And the third, you'll focus on like society, or there's a version of it that's sort of in fourths. So it's like first yourself and then your family and then sort of society. And then you sort of go spiritual and you sort of just like realize all this stuff is made up and none of it matters. And you kind of got to go sit in the forest and like figure it out for yourself because there's like nothing left. There's like nothing left to do. Right. It's just like, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to die, but like, what does all this mean? So yeah, it's kind of funny. Like a lot of cultures have sort of figured that out and baked that in. It's just like part of the human experience, I think. And then it's weird because it is a weird thing for founders. I think successful founders or people who have some degree of success early, because you kind of hit that place like when you're 30 or 35
right.
instead of like 50 or 55. And then you have this extra 20 years and then you sort of wake up and you're like, well, what am I supposed to do now?
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
actually like very disconcerting. It's actually kind of,
Yeah, it's like very spiritual, very fast. Yeah.
yeah, it does. And it's also, it's funny. It's sort of like, I think it's also interesting because there's a lot of data around how founders have more mental health issues, like very well documented. Depression and suicide rates and stuff are much higher. And I don't think that's an accident. There's probably some degree of correlation there too with the types of people who tend to become founders and are sufficiently dissatisfied that they go start something. But it's funny because it's not correlated with success, right? So it's not like all of a sudden you become successful and then all of a sudden you're less depressed. It actually turns out you're just depressed for different reasons. And so like there's something like in that journey where like you then have to figure out how to like navigate that for yourself.
Yeah, it's been super interesting. I've been working with this coach, Matt Moshari, who he can articulate this a lot better than I can, but I've come to believe it for what it's worth. Is his big thing is like, you shouldn't be motivated by fear, or like fear is not real.
1,000%.
I actually think that has been by far the most helpful thing to try to help me navigate this. Cause like a year ago, I was like 7 out of 10 happy. It was pretty good. I've always been like pretty chill for a founder, I think, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
But like I'd be stressed by work. Of course, there's like stressful things that come up. I'd be stressed by like social situations because I'm just like innately like an awkward nerd or whatever. And like all this stuff. But I think in the past year, focusing on that a lot for what it's worth. And I give a lot of credit to Matt and people like you that I've had the fortune to talk with about this. But now I literally don't feel stressed by work at all anymore. And I like don't feel stressed in social situations or anything like that.
That's awesome.
And that's taken a lot of work, but I'm curious if you've kind of had
that was my number one lesson. Yeah.
realization.
That was my number one lesson from my first startup, which was, it was like a very, very small success. We like eked out, an exit, but, I realized in retrospect, I thought about it a lot and the decision-making, and the number one realization I had was we made so many decisions out of fear that, and we were so worried about protecting our downside that if you operate that way, you inevitably end up in a worse situation than if you focus on maximizing your upside. Like an analogy here, that's a little bit more grounded maybe is like, there's this kind of, like financial advice that you see floating around that gets spread a lot, which is like, here's how to minimize your taxes. And you're like, okay, but that you're like focusing on like the 40% piece of the thing. Like what you should really do, that's not the way to be wealthy. The way to be wealthy is to figure out how to make 10x the money. Right. And so you're just like kind of focused on the wrong part of it. And yeah, that was probably my biggest realization with my first startup is like, we made so many decisions out of fear that we just ended up making a bunch of really suboptimal decisions.
Yeah.
That then compounds because it's a cascading set of decisions.
Exponential.
Too. Yeah. It just compounds. It's multiplicative for sure.
The other thing I kind of realized or have become like more realizing over time is how similar different parts of life are. Like a ton of the things that I've learned on this kind of journey that we just talked about through work for the most part for us have been super impactful in my like personal life and friendships and stuff
Mm.
too. And I think that kind of advice, don't be motivated by fear.
Yeah.
Like fear is just the base level thing. It's like a
Yeah.
superset of like anxiety or, awkwardness or a lot of these different things. And those can play a really big part, I think, in a lot of people's relationships, not everybody, but for some
Yeah.
people. So I think that's
Yeah.
been super helpful for me too. And I've just kind of had this realization that things you learn in one part of life, whether it's like a relationship or work,
Yeah.
like you can use them in other parts of your life too. And I feel like I just don't really hear that many people talking about that. You hear like a podcast or something and it'll be like, oh, let's just like talk about how to start a startup or like whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
not that many people really talk about how does that relate to the rest of the parts of your life.
Yeah. There's a related thing here I've thought a lot about too, which is part of that growing in that process is like scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset, which I think is very
Mm.
closely tied to this concept of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's in part because when you are operating in a scarcity mindset, which it might be well grounded, it might be that you actually have scarce resources. Then you're really operating from a place of fear. And it turns out the way most people are raised is through a scarcity mindset or a zero sum mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's because most of the world is trained to think that way. A lot of industries do work that way. But really, one of the wonderful things about technology and one of the wonderful things about being an entrepreneur is it's strictly non-zero sum. Like the whole
Right.
idea is to create value, is to create
Right.
something from nothing. And so you really, like, to be successful, have to undo all of that scarcity mindset thinking. You really, and in every place of your life. And like to me, like the fear-based decision making is just one example of that. But that's like a really hard thing for most people to undo. It probably took me a good 7 to 10 years to like identify all of those places and catch myself doing it and then like unlearn it and like untrain that muscle. Um,
Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
best people I've worked with are very, very good at abundance mindset thinking and very rational thinking in this way, non-fear based.
Yeah.
All the best people I've worked with have always operated that way.
I totally agree with that. I think I, in my life, has just been extremely fortunate, like relatively wealthy parents, like private school, like work in tech. My first job was at Coinbase for heck's sake, and that like went super well, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I feel very fortunate, but I definitely agree. So to me, it has always kind of seemed innate, but like I've seen that in other people as well. I think especially a lot of people that work in other industries,
Yeah.
like especially finance, is very like zero sum if
Very
you're just
serious.
trying to like get
Yeah.
alpha against other people all day.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that is really impactful for the cultures of like a finance company versus a tech company, probably versus a lot of other industries too, where
Yeah.
like the
Agreed.
culture in tech is very collaborative because it's very positive sum. And I
Yeah.
think that's fairly unique.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. I mean, in tech, it's like the two or three other major industries, right? Like if you just look at the economy, it's like tech, there's energy, there's healthcare, there's government. These are like the major sectors of the economy. Finance. And what's really interesting and what I think sets technology apart is um, that the time to success is very short. So, and I think
Mm,
that actually changes everything downstream. That's my like diagnosis of why tech ends up operating in a very non-zero sum
mm,
mindset.
mm-hmm,
I mean, like
mm-hmm.
fundamentally, that's what technology is, right? Technology is taking two things that used to be a trade-off and not making them a trade-off anymore. That to me is like the fundamental definition of like what is a
Huh.
technology. It's a
That's
thing
super
that
interesting.
like
Yeah.
gets rid of a trade-off that used to be a trade-off. So like like zero knowledge proofs are a good example. Like it used to be that if you wanted privacy, you had to trade off auditability and the ability to trace bad actors and all this kind of stuff. And zero knowledge actually just changes that equation fundamentally. It just says no. Like you can have privacy and you can have private transactions and anonymity, but you can also generate zero knowledge proofs that say like you're properly KYC'd by such and such attested pod. Coinbase says ZK, generates a ZK proof that says you're KYC'd with them, and that like the transaction that you're doing is not more than $10,000, and that you and the other counterparty are both KYC'd by Coinbase, and so we don't need to worry about AML, but you both have privacy now, right? And so you've
Mm-hmm.
sort of made the thing that was a trade-off no longer a trade-off. And that creates abundance. But the other dimension to technology that I think is unique is that the time to success is really short. And so you can go from being a nobody, you can be like a 19-year-old nerdy hacker writing on Bitcoin forums to like starting Ethereum and then being a billionaire in like 4 years. And that's just not possible anywhere else in any other sector. Like you can't do that in
Right.
healthcare. You got to be a doctor first, and it takes 4 years, and you do a fellowship, and then you got to get trained. And so, you can't do that in finance. I
Yeah.
think there was a time that you could. I don't think you can anymore. You can't do that in government. Like you can't be a senator until you're 35, right? So by definition, you can't. And so you start enumerating like all these other industries, and you realize tech is this really unique property that you can become outlandishly successful in a very short period of time. And the second order effect, therefore, is that everybody has to help everybody else. And that creates this like whole culture of non-zero sum mindedness, because it's like this random person you're talking to today might end up being a billionaire in 3 or 4 years because the timeline to success is so short. And so like all of the like abundance mindset, a lot of the like, yeah, there's like a lot of culture stuff in tech that gets set apart. But to me, it sort of like comes down to those two things that are really unique about tech and software. Like we kind of live in this golden era of software. I don't know if it'll forever be true, but I think it happens to currently be true that the timeline to success is so short that it has a lot of downstream cultural effects.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just want to say back the first thing that you said to you,
Yeah.
just to make sure I understand, because I feel like that's super interesting. You're saying your kind of fundamental definition of technology is taking things that are a trade-off and making them no longer a trade-off. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Interesting. That's super interesting. Yeah, I think one of the other things I've heard a lot of people who've gone through this transition of having a lot of success to having that existential crisis to making some changes or whatever in their life say, just maybe just another way of saying some of the same things we've already talked about, is I only do things that I want to do. Like I've heard a
Mm,
number of people say this independently. I don't know if I've heard
mm,
you say it, so I'm curious if that kind of resonates with you. Like that's something that I think has
mm.
resonated with me a lot recently. I think the way I would kind of describe it is like you don't have to do anything anymore, right? Like you've already had enough success. You already have enough
Mm.
money. You
Yeah.
ideally already are around like the people that you love and care about. So what are you going to do?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you want to do? You don't have to do anything. So it's sort of just
Yeah.
like that. So maybe you choose to do a lot of the same things, but just doing them because you feel like you want to do them rather than you have to do them, I feel like is a pretty
Hmm.
fundamental shift.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's true. I think that the risk with saying it that way is that it can be interpreted hedonistically,
Mm.
which kind of gets
Hmm.
back at the other thing, which is like it's not fundamentally about the hedonistic desire. It's not like I need a bigger house or I need, and I
Right.
think if you continue to be driven by those things and that you're doing them because you want those things, because you want to do those, you want to do the thing because you want those things. I feel like you're not actually free. Like the kind of freedom that you're talking about to be able to do the things that you want to do, I think ultimately comes down to one of these other intrinsic motivations, which is like you're driven by spending time with the people that you really care about. You're driven by spending time on developing your craft and honing it, which or it's driven by some higher mission or higher purpose. And to me, the sort of signal there that you're in, and it's sort of, so it's like want and want prime. It's like it's the same word, but like the connotation is very different. And if you have like the
Yep.
hedonistic version of want, then you're going to pursue these like external things. And if you have the other version of it, then you're probably going to these more intrinsic things. And to me, the signal that you're in like that camp, in the want prime camp, which is like the intrinsic, is you don't really care if anybody knows who you are.
Mm.
Because to me, that's like the fundamental human primate behavior, which is like, because we're social animals, we need and seek validation from other people. And I think to me, the real crux of, are you doing a thing you want to do because truly you want to do it, is if nobody ever knows who you are. And
Mm.
if you can
Yeah.
like cross that line, if you're just like, I'm doing the thing I want to do, and it just doesn't matter to me if anybody ever knows who I am, or if anybody thinks I'm smart, or if anybody thinks I'm capable, I'm just being me. And so it's almost like self-expression. I'm just like self-expressing into the world. And like one day I die and that stops, and that's okay. And like, if you get to that point, that to me is the signal. And so a lot of times that's what I'm looking like when I'm having conversations with myself, even that's what I'm looking for, is just like, if I do this thing, if it's truly something I want, then I shouldn't care if anybody else knows that I did the thing. Um,
Yep.
you know what it reminds me of? Have you seen that? There's like that meme on Reddit about the shopping cart test. Have you seen that?
I don't think I've seen this one.
It's pretty funny. It's something like everything you need to know about a human. Um, you can determine whether or not you can determine about them based on whether or not they return the shopping cart after they're done with it in the parking lot. Right?
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
there's like nobody
Just
watching,
nobody ever
right? There's
knows.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
nobody ever knows if you turn back the
Yeah.
shopping cart, and like somebody's gonna come get the shopping cart, like some poor 16-year-old is gonna come like push a bunch of shopping carts around. Um, but that's like a good litmus test, right? It's just like if you put back the shopping, like nobody ever saw you do it, but it's like the right thing to do. And you're doing it because you want to do it, because it's the high integrity thing to do, and like it's just like keeps the parking lot
Yeah.
cleaner, and it's like shows that you care, and yada yada, right? It's almost like that. Like nobody knows that you do. if nobody ever knew that you were doing your craft, if you never made another cent, if you like never went on another podcast, if nobody knew who you were, like, would you still do the thing? And to me, that's like the proper definition of want.
Yeah.
But it's,
I think
as
that's a
like
really
primates,
good
it's hard
point.
to undo that.
Yeah, exactly. Like that actually is where I've gone recently too. So it's like, okay, step one, I don't have to do anything. Step two, I can do whatever I want to do. And then like step three, what do I want to do? That's actually like kind of a hard question that not a lot of
really
people
hard.
actually ask themselves, right?
It's really, really hard.
And getting like very deep and spiritual here, I guess. But I'm not an expert on this, but for what it's worth, my kind of thing I've learned in the past year, which is kind of saying the same thing that you said. And I think that's a really good test for it, is there's like a difference between your authentic self and your ego.
Yeah.
And you're sort of describing like, oh, like you can be really motivated by your ego, which is like, what do people care about me? Or, you know, am I like having a big visible impact or something like that? And then your authentic self like doesn't really care about that. I sort of had this experience that like, oh, like fear and anger and stuff, that's just really driven by your ego. And then like love and sadness and those sort of things are really driven by our authentic self. So that's kind of been the question I've been asking myself a lot recently. It's a very new thing for me. But just like, where are my motivations coming from? And like, literally, what do I want to do? And is this like an authentic desire or something of my ego? Which I think sounds like you agree with.
Yeah, I 1,000% agree. You know, I don't know how I think about negative emotions in like the authentic self context. I have to think about that one. It's not a question I've asked myself, but I 100% agree with the ego thing. It's something we talk about internally at Electric a lot too. Just like, I think ego is about the way you wish the world was. And as a founder or as an investor, if you have a disconnect between reality and the way that you wish things were, then you start making bad decisions. And so like having a better and accurate and more accurate understanding of reality and the way things really are requires you to set aside your ego, because it requires you to not have an emotional stake in what that means. But that's really hard to do. But the people who are able to do that end up being way better investors and way better founders. Because you sort of, it doesn't matter how you feel about it, right? It's like the reality is reality, and you're doing it for non-ego reasons. That's like a very common thread in my experience between really successful founders and really successful investors, is like they tend to be very low ego people.
I agree with that too. I think like one of the things that was surprising to me that I kind of realized in retrospect that I did well, and then I now try to tell other people is important, is being really self-aware is important as a founder, like knowing what you're really good at, like, and also like aware of the world and very, very perceptive in general, right? Because it's sort of what you're saying, like you want to see the world for how it really is. And that's actually pretty hard to do. Like not that many people do that. And then very also hard. See yourself for who you are and be like, I'm good at these things. I'm not good at these things. Given that, like, how should I run a company? Like for me, just as an example, like I don't really like talking to people that I don't know that much for the most part. And so I would talk to these founders that had success with starting companies that way. And they're like, oh yeah, you got to get out there. You got to network. You got to like hire all these people. And I'm just like, I don't really want to. So like, I'm not going to do it. But then I was sort of like, okay, given I'm not going to do that, I like really need to do an excellent job on like the engineering side, or just like hire the 3 or 4 core engineers. And like, what is a product that we can build that doesn't need to scale to like 1,000-person company relatively quickly? So I feel like that's important as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's a thread you said in there that I think is sort of a different facet of the same thing, but is worth pulling on. And I think the self-awareness and ego thing, there's an element of honesty there, which is really hard for most people. And so like one thing I've been working on just slowly in the background is codifying our values at Electric. And so the very first value is founders come first. We come second. And so that's sort of like, if we just do that, we'll be successful long-term. Just like put the founder first and don't worry about the rest of the stuff. It's all implementation details. But the second one is be honest. And I wrote a whole like 2.5 pages on it. And a lot of it comes down to this, which is like the entire world is basically lying to you, because, and you're lying to yourself, because honesty is really painful, because like seeing people for who they really are, seeing yourself for who you really are, seeing the world for what it really is, that disconnect between the way that you wish you were or the way that you wish other people were, or, you know, the quality of the work that you wish you could produce versus what you're actually producing, like the degree of success that you have relative to what you wish you had. Like that delta is really painful for most people. But the ability to like deal with that pain and acknowledge that pain and understand it and not have it bother you is actually what, to me, it means to be honest. And so if you can be honest with yourself, and you can be honest with other people, and you can recognize, unfortunately, when most of the world is not being honest with you, it lets you have a much better understanding of reality as it is, which is like the fundamental thing. Like if you can have a better model of reality, um, then you win. Like that's actually how you make progress, you know? Because like
Yeah,
reality doesn't care about your ego.
it's a great way
Reality
to
doesn't
say
care
it.
about your emotions. So this sort of like idea of like self-awareness and ego and sort of like how do you deal with that? To me, there's a very related concept here about honesty, which is like you have to be brutally
Yeah,
honest with yourself. And it's just hard because actually most people are not. And I don't mean that
yeah,
as a criticism of them, because it is painful, right? It's like it's a hard thing to be honest
yeah,
with yourself, and it's a hard thing to be honest with other people. I mean, you see like VCs do this all the time. They're just like, oh, let me
yeah.
like say it's just you don't have enough traction, when the real answer is like your team is not that good.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But they don't want to say that because there's a real social cost to that. And that's like a painful thing to say to somebody. And there are like more productive ways to say that, right? It's like, hey, you should augment your team in this way, or like you should think about building out the team in this way, or yada, yada. Um, and so people just don't want to be honest, right? And so it turns out like I would assert actually like the vast majority of human interactions are not honest, because honesty is
Yeah.
really painful. It comes
I
with a real
agree.
cost. It comes with a real social cost.
Yeah, I think that honesty and that kind of authentic part of yourself that I was kind of talking about are very related and very similar to. And
Yeah.
maybe if I can just repeat that back, because I feel like it's really important in slightly different words, what you were saying. You said something like, if you just realize the world for what it is and you for who you are, then you win. Like, I agree
Yeah.
with that. It's like that's sort of the job of
Yeah.
life, arguably, but like
Yeah.
certainly
Yeah.
of a
Totally.
entrepreneur. And I feel like
Yeah.
it's really
Totally.
important.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
And in like so many things, it's simple but hard. You know.
Yeah, exactly. Like it sounds like these things sound so simple, and it's like,
Yeah. Yeah. But it's
okay,
really
yeah,
fucking hard.
of course I should be honest. Like, let's move on
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
life. Like,
It's
let
really
me
hard.
like figure out how to do coding or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like
Yeah.
actually everything starts with that, and you like build up
Yeah,
from
yeah.
there.
Simple but hard.
Um,
It's like all of
yeah,
like all of like the best life lessons are very simple but actually very hard.
yeah. One of the other things I've been thinking about recently related to this that I felt like I've just been doing for a long time is perceiving other people, basically.
Hmm.
Like, you know how a lot of times, like, I feel like maybe let's just focus in on startups and founders and stuff for a second. Like a
Yeah.
VC or an angel or something can just have
Yeah.
a 15-30 minute meeting with somebody and come away from that meeting like, wow, this person is like amazing. And I feel like
Yeah.
people usually say things like, oh, this person is really smart. Right.
Yeah.
And being intelligent is absolutely part of it. But I feel like there's something more there. It's just like, oh, this
Hmm.
person like really resonates and like what they say is very true or authentic, or they seemed really honest, or
Yeah.
they're a clear thinker, like all these things. Like I
Yeah.
oftentimes, I don't know how long it takes other people, but for me, I come away from these conversations in like the first 2 to 5 minutes usually of like talking to a new like candidate who's going to potentially
Yeah.
join DYDX or something like that, being like, oh, like, 95% yes, or like 95% no. I've been trying to
Yeah.
be able to reflect. Like, I wonder if you've thought about this more as like a VC, who that's like a lot of the part of the job is being
Yeah.
perceptive and like figuring out who to bet on versus not, and establish relationships with. But I think
Yeah.
it's really a big part of life in general, right? Like everybody approaches this through like friendships or like romantic relationships or like whatever else. So I'm curious if you've thought about that or if you have any thoughts
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. I have a lot. It's the last statement you made, I think, is an interesting one. It's like it's actually not clear to me that that leads to a happier life. Like it's sort of a variation of ignorance is bliss. Actually, if you're just like not
Hmm.
that perceptive about other people, you might be willing to tolerate a lot more.
Hmm.
And arguably you would actually be
Interesting.
happier. Because I don't think most people are malicious. So it's not, I'm not saying like you're letting sociopaths into your life and they like take all your money or something. It's more like, you know, everybody is flawed and everybody's imperfect. And maybe if you're just like not that perceptive about those things, then it's like actually easier to navigate life. And
Hmm.
actually like being hyper perceptive about these things is, it just creates a bunch of tension and baggage actually. Um, because you can see those things. And so then you have to work harder to like accept those things and accept those things about yourself too, right? Because in the same way that you can be critical of other people, you can then be critical of yourself. Like if you're hyper perceptive, like self-awareness, another way to say self-awareness is you're just hyper perceptive and you can sort of
Hmm.
understand these very subtle things and then chip away at them and make yourself better. But the consequence of that is you're like hyper aware about these things, and yourself and other people. And that's actually just kind of grinds on you, and it can grind on other people. It's like hard. I have to imagine it's like, I don't have to imagine. People have told me it's like that makes me a challenging person to deal with, because it's sort of like I'm sort of pushing on people to do that. And for a lot of people, it's a very hard thing to sort of like be constantly chipping away at yourself all the time. Like it's a hard thing to do. And so it's actually arguably potentially the ability to do that is like makes you less happy. And that might be why like in society, like most people are not wired to do that thing, because it turns out like if everybody in society was doing that thing all the time, everybody would just be like really unhappy all the time. Right. And so maybe there's like some social level thing of like, you need enough people in a society to do that, to make progress, but you can't have everybody doing that. I don't know.
That's an interesting viewpoint. Yeah. I mean, one thing I would push back on that though, that I feel like is really important in life, especially if you want to have a lot of success, is choosing who to be around and like choosing who to invest in, whether that's money or time or whatever else. I feel like the best people, I mean, I feel like you do a great job of this, and a lot of other people that I really respect, they're just like really good at telling early on, like before everybody else can, like who to invest in from like a time, like money, reputation perspective. So I feel like it is important from that perspective.
1000%. I think if you want to be world class at what you do, then the ability to really properly read and understand people is critical, because that's how you get scale and leverage in the world, in society, with a handful of exceptions perhaps. And so it's a really important and critical skill. It's just one of those things that's like, well, it's an interesting question of like, does the average person actually need that? Or is it actually just like a bunch of extra baggage and work that makes them unhappy? I think it's good. I think it leads to a more fulfilled life. There's another sort of like common trade-off here that you see all the time. And actually children are an example of this. It's a trade-off between happiness and fulfillment. Like there are things that can make you happy. And then there are things that will make you fulfilled, and they're hard. And arguably doing a startup is that too. Like probably doing a startup has made you less happy, but you're far more fulfilled, because you're doing something meaningful and important in the world. And you've done something that you're proud of. But it was like quite painful to get there. Like actually just having a good, solid software engineering job where you make good money and you get to like work out every day and like sleep 8 hours a day. And like, that might actually make you day to day way happier. And you might die a happy person. Like you just would never know this, but you would never know this other type of fulfillment and self-satisfaction and self-awareness and all these things. Right. But anyway, popping up the stack a little bit, I think it's a really, really important skill if you want to be truly world class at what you do. And so one thing I've thought about is like, well, where does that come from? I'm kind of curious what you think and where that comes from for you. For me, it turns out I've thought about it a bunch. And I think part of the reason I'm really good at it is I grew up as an Indian kid in Kentucky and Ohio, where there weren't a lot of people like me. And so, in the 90s, you were either white or black. Like there were not that many Asians in those communities. There were, even sort of like the Mexican, Latin American migrations hadn't fully hit the Midwest. And so outside of like Chicago. And so I had to learn to read the room really fast. Like I had to learn to figure out like who was actually going to be adversarial, who was actually going to be open-minded, whose parents were going to be adversarial and open-minded, which teachers were like actually intrinsically sort of racist. And so, because you just run the numbers and you're like, okay, if like this is like the mid 90s, late 90s, when I'm in like elementary school, those teachers might be in their 50s, right, or 60s. And so they were really raised in like the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And that was a very different time in a place like Kentucky, right? So they hadn't aged out of the population yet. So it's not a criticism necessarily of teachers in Kentucky today, but this is like 30 years ago, right? So, and so I think back on that now and I'm like, oh yeah, it totally makes sense that I can read people, because I had to. Like I just had to figure out like the threat vector, right? It's just like, okay, is that person actually like, going to treat me well? Is that person a physical threat to me? Like, and so at least for me, that I sort of like unpacked it actually comes from that place. And I suspect my operating theory actually for a lot of great founders and a lot of great investors is that there is some sort of superpower there. And that superpower is actually fundamentally an imbalance. And that imbalance actually comes from what like a psychologist or a therapist would actually call trauma, which is a totally loaded word because it implies like something very severe. Yeah. But it's just sort of like something happens in your life that sort of knocks you askew a little bit and like creates this imbalance out of sort of like self-preservation. but if you think of that as a weakness, it will sort of be like crippling. And if instead you sort of turn it on its head and you're like, oh, actually I'm imbalanced and that means I'm different and I need to lean into that somehow, it can actually be a superpower.
Yeah, there's so much stuff there. I mean, maybe tackling the last point first. Like, I agree with that imbalance being really important. And that's what I was talking about with like the self awareness and like really what you can lean into. I
Yeah.
mean, I probably had a fairly different upbringing from you, but for me, my
Yeah.
imbalance was kind of something else. Like, I was not go into this, but like my parents had a pretty tough divorce when I was 13, and my dad had like a lot of mental health issues, and that was hard to deal with. But I sort of came out of that situation be like my superpower, which is can be both good and bad, is that I'm really good at like putting my feelings aside and just being like full
Mhm.
thinking mode,
Yeah.
which can cause problems in life, like, but it can
Totally.
also be really good, you know. So
Yeah.
for DYDX
Yeah.
and crypto,
What?
people are always like, Antonio, like, how are you so stable, like in all of these
Yeah.
times? And I'm like, oh, like, you know, it's just like going up and it's like, here's the logical
Totally.
reasons why
So
I'm
why do you
like
think that
thinking this
is?
thing. But yeah.
Like, what's the root cause of
Which
that?
part?
Like, where's the ability to sort of like set aside the emotion and sort of like be rational
It
in this
was just
way? And
from the trauma that you were kind of talking about, right? Like that was just innately the way I responded to it.
yeah.
Was it was really emotionally hard, and I
Yeah.
got kind of depressed. But like the way I got over that was, oh, I'm just gonna like compartmentalize my feelings and like put them over here. And like one of the things, but that has negative like repercussions as
Totally.
well. Like in a lot of
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
past
It's an imbalance.
relationships, my
Yeah.
partners will be like, we'll have like an argument as anybody does, and I'll just go like extremely logic mode while
Yeah.
they're, you know, like anybody
Yeah.
else, like a normal person would be upset, and like it's like how
Yeah.
people would normally act, and it'd be like, Antonio, like, why are you not upset? Do you even like care
Yeah.
about this
Yeah.
relationship? Like, what is going on
Yeah.
here? So there, and I've kind of, you know, started doing therapy, whatever, to unpack a lot of that and like scale that back a little bit, and kind of be able to access those feelings. So I think there can be
Yeah.
positives, which I think I benefited from, and there can be negatives, which then you've got to
Yeah.
like go and figure out later in your life how to like heal that. But I think like having that, I think imbalance is a really good way to put it, is not a bad thing. And like understanding what that is can be really
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah. There's a great story
Yeah.
I think about. I'm totally going to forget who it is, but it's a story of this little girl who was in school and she basically couldn't sit still. And so the teachers were really frustrated and they would always try to get her
Mm-hmm.
to sit still. And, um, and eventually they called the mom and they're like, hey, look, we should send her to like a therapist. Maybe she has like some mental health
Mm-hmm.
issues or like she's got like some physical stuff. Maybe we should put her on drugs, like, and medicate her. And so her mom took her to some therapist and was really, really just lucky that it was somebody who was smart. And the therapist sat with the daughter for a while and the girl for a while, and then sort of came back out and was like, talked to the mom, was like, hey, look, let me show you something. And took the mom over to the room. And the little girl in the room was just dancing by herself because he turned on some music. And he's like, look, you don't have like a broken mental health disorder child. You have a dancer. Put her in some dance classes and let her
I
like
love
lean
that.
into this.
Yeah.
And she's I forget her name, but she's now like a very very well regarded choreographer. Like she's like a
Mm-hmm.
world class dancer and choreographer now. She's like one of the best in the world. But I always remember that story because it's like it's you know that's it, you know and actually the art of being a good investor. This is like my favorite part of the job is like I'm trying to find all of those people in the world and
Mm-hmm.
like cultivate that. It's like actually the
I love that.
opposite of what society does. Society like takes that person and is like, we need to medicate this person and like get
Mm-hmm.
them to conform. And like I kind of look at my job as like finding that person and be like, oh, you're a dancer. Like go do this
Mm-hmm.
thing over here and like lean into the thing that makes you special. Um, but yeah, it's funny, right? Like it's two sides of the same thing. Like a lot of people would look at that and say that's an imbalance. The inability to sit still and go to school is the thing you need to quash. And actually I look at that and I'm like, oh, double down on that. Like
Yeah.
what makes you weird and different is like what makes you special and interesting.
Yeah. I love that. Maybe in the last couple of minutes that we have, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently too is intuition, which is
Mm,
kind of what I was alluding to at the previous question.
yeah.
And I think I've just heard a lot of people say things like this in a lot of different situations, like, "Oh, how do you make decisions? Like, how do you know who to trust? Like, how do you know how
Yeah.
to like invest in? Like all these things." And if
Yeah.
you hear like the best people in the world, even like, you know, I heard a speech from Tom Brady one time, and
Yeah.
somebody asked him like, "How do you decide who to throw it to?" And he's just like,
Yeah.
"It's intuition, right?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's sort of like a little bit of a cop out, right?
Yeah.
This is like, okay, what does that actually mean? So I've been trying to think about that, been trying to
Yeah.
talk, like I talked about that with George on the first episode.
Yeah.
And And at least for me, as somebody who is coming from life as innately a super thinking person, like I was
Yeah.
just mentioning, like getting more in touch with my feelings. And I feel like intuition is a feeling. And I feel like once you can really start trusting that, that's really
Yeah.
valuable. Like one of the things I've started to do at DYDX is act based off my feelings rather
Mm.
than my thoughts, which has actually gone extremely well. But even
Mm.
in like small situations, like I'll just be sitting in a meeting and like something will be going on and I'm just
Mm.
like, I don't feel good about this. So I'm gonna like
Yeah.
say something immediately. Like
Yeah.
historically, I would have been like, oh, why is that? Let me like think through this and like think about if that's actually reasonable or not. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that everybody should just act purely based off their feelings, but I think there is something to be said for those who have thought a lot about these kind of existential questions like,
Yeah.
what is real? What do I want? Who am I? Like,
Yeah.
what are my authentic feelings versus my inauthentic ones? If you
Yeah.
have like a really good sense of that, then you can just be driven a lot by intuition and by feeling. So I'm curious if
Yeah.
that kind of resonates with you as well.
Yeah. Couple thoughts there. Have you seen the did you see that Rick Rubin CNN interview? Do you remember
I
this?
don't
Do you
think
know what I'm about
so.
to say?
What is that
So
about?
Rick Rubin is this really famous music producer. If you Google him, he's like this large guy, big white beard, white hair, and he's worked with like Jay-Z and Madonna and Aerosmith and Johnny Cash and
Mm-hmm.
just like legendary musicians, and they all love him. But he became a meme last year because he said something like, "I know nothing about music." And the
Yeah.
interviewer's like, what are you talking about? You're like the most successful
Yeah.
music producer of all time." And his answer was something to the effect of like, he doesn't know anything about music. He's not formally trained. He can't like, he doesn't have perfect pitch, but he is so in tune with what he likes, and he's
Mm,
so in tune with who the other person is, that he's
mm,
able to get them to express who they are through music by telling them and articulating back to them how the music makes him feel. And that's like his superpower. Actually,
mm.
it turns out, like the deep,
Interesting.
deep connection that he has with how the music makes him feel, and his ability to articulate that and try to get the other person to feel something is what allows the music to be unique and good, and produce
Mm-hmm.
music that like people wouldn't otherwise produce. And so I think like that there's definitely something to this idea of intuition. And then I think unpacking that a little bit is sort of like, what um where is your intuition actually well aligned with reality, right?
Mm,
And like that's the hard part. Like I think people like, I have feelings about like art that just may not be aligned with like what makes good art or what makes good
mm,
music,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
And so I think like the meta thing there is like, I do think everybody is like, there's some degree of intuition that people have, and I think probably over the next 20 to 40 years we'll unpack, as we start to understand neural nets and AI and like, that whole field that continues to evolve. I think we'll start to understand ourselves as humans
mm,
even better. And so we'll start to understand and maybe unpack, what does it even mean to have intuition, and like what data feeds into these neurons and like helps us understand that. um, but setting that aside for a second, I think everybody has intuitions, and the question is, where are your intuitions well aligned with reality? And if you can figure that out, then actually the
mm,
job becomes really
mm,
easy, because then it's like an 80 IQ. It's like a midwit situation. It's like the left
mm-hmm.
end of the curve and the right end of the curve are just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just feel it. It's just intuition. And in the middle, you're trying to like overanalyze it. And so to me, like the way you end up on the right part of the bell
Mm,
curve is, where does it turn out your natural intuitions are very well aligned with reality. And if you can figure that out, then that's like a big unlock actually to being successful. And for me, it just turns out early stage founders is like a place where my intuition happens to map really, really well to reality.
yeah.
It's funny. I actually posted on Twitter maybe a week or two ago. Um, and the question was something like, suppose there's a monkey, and every Sunday the monkey goes in and just like picks a stock, and then that week the stock goes up 20%.
I saw that.
You saw that? Yeah. And so
Yeah.
like, how many weeks in a row would the monkey have to do that before you let the monkey manage all your money? And it was really
Mhm.
interesting because it was something like 35% of people basically said never, which is really interesting, right? It's actually like,
Yeah.
it turns out like people are going to pass up doubling their money basically every month because they don't like the process. Like it feels too
Mm,
random to them. Which is, I think, is like a really interesting human insight, that like there's something about intuition that we don't like, because we can't quantify the
mm,
process. We can't like tell you what the process
yeah.
is. It like makes people really uncomfortable, to the tune of like, you don't want to double your money every month because you don't understand the process that the monkey is using, even though it just keeps making money. So anyway, it's like a silly way to sort of get at the same thing. It's just
Yeah.
like, so I feel like so much of what I do is like the monkey. I just sort of like, I'm like, I don't know why, but this person's going to be a great founder. And like more often than not, I'm right. But it's kind of a weird thing, because I kind of feel like a monkey just like throwing darts a little bit, but it somehow
Mhm.
works.
Mm-hmm. Well, Avichal, this has been extremely interesting. I think I only got through 3 of the 15 questions I wrote. So we might have to do it again sometime.
Awesome. Looking forward.
But I really appreciate it.
Oh, my
And
pleasure, man.
it's great talking
It's
as
great to see you.
always.
It's great to see you.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll let you
you
go.
as well.
See you, man.